The gas war, the secret scramble for the world's last helium. The MRI's magnets screamed, then went silent. Warm gas roared through a silver vent, helium boil-off, while a tech muttered, "We've got minutes." Across the coast, a rocket countdown froze at T18. Valves wouldn't open. Helium was gone, and if you think that's someone else's problem, wait until your scan or launch date hits a calendar shaped by this gas. 3 chokepoints decide who gets the last helium. America's Panhandle pipeline, Qatar's North Field, Russia's Yamal. One decision flips leverage. Here's the part nobody explains, and the part almost no one realizes controls their healthcare and launches. Earth doesn't make helium in any useful way. Once it escapes, it's gone. Hospitals, fabs, rockets, neutron labs, everything leans on a vanishing gas. And the fuse? A bland law from 1996 that looked harmless until the shortages began. Helium's physics, born underground, gone to space. To understand why that scanner screamed, we go back into the rock. Helium isn't mined like copper, it's born as fallout from radioactive decay. Deep in crustal minerals, uranium and thorium spit alpha particles, bear helium nuclei into the lattice. They slow, steal electrons, turn into helium atoms, and start a jailbreak, out of crystals into pores toward any seal tight enough to trap them with natural gas. Now the catch. Helium is the second lightest thing in the universe and the least social. It barely interacts, won't stick to much, and in the upper atmosphere, the fastest fraction just leaves. Gravity can't hang on forever. On human timescales, our planet leaks helium like a punctured balloon. There's no factory that fixes that. Stars make helium by fusion. We don't. We either intercept it underground when geology piles up enough in the right places, or we lose it forever. That's the scarcity. The utility comes from its temperament. Helium's electron shell is full, so it sits out chemical drama. It doesn't burn, doesn't corrode, doesn't gunk lines. In chipmaking, that calm behavior protects fragile plasmas and sweeps oxygen away from processes where oxygen would wreck atom-thick layers. In spaceflight, helium pressurizes cryogenic fuel tanks and purges plumbing that can't risk a spark. Reliability loves a gas that refuses to react. But the liquid is the deal-breaker. At 4.2 Kelvin, helium liquefies without freezing. Push toward 2 Kelvin and it goes superfluid, no viscosity, climbing walls, slipping through micro-leaks, hauling heat in ways nothing else can. Superconducting magnets live there. Warm them a little, they quench, snapping back to electrical resistance, dumping stored energy as heat and shock. Liquid helium is the moat that keeps that dragon asleep. Nitrogen at 77 Kelvin is a sweater in a snowstorm. Neon is scarce and heavy. Hydrogen is cold, sure, but near oxygen it's an accident report. If you need 4 Kelvin at scale, substitutes run out fast. So MRIs live by helium. A clinical magnet holds 1,000 liters or more. Modern zero boil-off designs recondense helium gas back to liquid with built-in cryocoolers, stretching time between fills, but the bath still anchors the system. Lose too much and you're scheduling a controlled warm-up and rebuild. In a hospital, that means canceled scans and rescheduled surgeries. In research, rationing means paused experiments and lost beam-time windows. In Fabs, allocation notices force engineers to rewrite recipes, shaving helium use and accepting slower throughput to survive the week. There's another trap. Helium piggybacks on natural gas, and most gas fields carry trivial traces, parts per million you'd never extract. A few places have enough, thanks to ancient basement rocks, uranium-rich sources, and tight seals that bottled it up for geologic ages. That's the Panhandle Hugoton trend under Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, pockets in the Rockies, Algeria's Hassi Armel, Qatar's North Field, and Russia's Siberian plains. Producers strip helium during gas processing. If a plant shuts for maintenance, helium supply shuts too. If an LNG train trips, the helium welded to it goes dark that day. Even after capture, helium punishes sloppiness. The atoms slip through seals, liquid finds leaks you didn't know you had. Every transfer, liquefier to doer, doer to ISO container, container to instrument, skims off a loss. Boil-off never sleeps, you only slow it. Delay a container in heat and you're bleeding product into the air. That's why operators obsess over vacuum-jacketed lines, quick connects, and reclaim systems. The best labs recycle. Capture boil-off, compress it, clean it, and reliquefy. It's expensive to build and cheap compared with losing weeks of work. Why not pull helium from air? It's there at roughly 5 parts per million. Technically, you can strip it with cryogenic columns or membranes. Economically, you're pushing mountains of air for a trickle, possible only if electricity is cheap and prices soar. Could we make helium in reactors? Alpha particles form helium inside fuel and cladding, but recovering that isn't a supply chain, it's a materials headache. For the foreseeable future, geology sets the menu. Human habits layered on that physics, and they weren't careful. Years of stable prices trained hospitals to vent boil off and labs to run open dewars. Fabs treated helium as a line item, not a single point of failure. Shortages unlearned those habits fast. Hospitals retrofit better shields and serviceable cryocoolers. Universities pool budgets for campus liquefiers and teach zero-loss fills. Chipmakers co-fund recovery at upstream gas processors and add reclaim loops in etch bays. None of this is free. All of it is cheaper than shutting down. Meanwhile, global structure matters. The United States built a unique helium world, pipe, storage, enrichment that buffered shocks for decades. Qatar attached helium to some of the cheapest LNG on Earth, turning low concentrations into real tonnage with scale and reliability. Russia planned Arctic volumes that would swing the market, then ran into sanctions, spares, and timelines that slipped. Each pillar has different failure modes. When two wobble at once, you feel it in emergency rooms and at launch pads, not just in price charts. Hold two truths at once. Helium is a byproduct market, and helium that escapes is gone. That combination creates thin margins, hard constraints, and stakes that land on people, not abstractions. The MRI tech who hears a magnet scream, the process engineer shaving purge time at 3 a.m., the launch director staring at a frozen countdown, they're all riding the same physics. And the physics doesn't care what we planned. The federal helium machine, how war built a buffer. To see how a hospital's schedule ends up tied to a Texas cavern, we have to walk into a century where lift and fire shaped policy. After World War I, the U.S. Navy wanted airships that wouldn't turn into torches. Hydrogen was out. Helium's one superpower, it doesn't burn, suddenly mattered more than cost. That single property pulled helium out of lab glassware and into national strategy. Geologists mapped seeps across the Great Plains. The Panhandle and Hugoton trend stood out. Old basement rocks, uranium nearby, seals tight enough to catch the leaks of a million years. By the 1930s, blimps were coastal sentries, and helium was sneaking into radar benches and rocket test stands. World War II didn't invent the demand, it normalized it. The Cold War then scaled it into infrastructure. Balloons that surfed the jet stream, missile labs with cryogenic plumbing, liquid oxygen tanks that had to be purged clean and inert. Helium threaded through all of it. When a system needed an ultra-cold, non-reactive handler, the short list usually landed on the same element. Washington built hardware around that reality. Outside Amarillo, engineers took a depleted gas reservoir, Bush Dome, and turned it into a bank. The concept was audacious and simple. Private plants would strip crude helium out of natural gas streams, mostly nitrogen and methane with a few % helium, then push that crude into a federal artery, the Panhandle pipeline. Down the line, refiners would plug in, draw feedstock, and upgrade it to high-purity product for dewars and ISO containers. At the midpoint, the cliffside plant enriched the mixed stream so storage and redelivery made sense. Bush Dome itself became the swing. Inject when supply outran demand, withdraw when the system hiccuped. On paper, it looked like a warehouse. In control rooms, it felt like an instrument. Operators matched pressures across hundreds of miles, nudging valves as compressors in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas rose and fell. If a private plant tripped at midnight, Cliffside bled a little stored helium into the flow, and a refiner in Kansas kept loading tankers. A defense contractor welded beneath an inert blanket as if nothing happened. The reserve wasn't just hedging. It was a living machine that shaved volatility off every shift. Policy adjusted as the machine matured. Amendments in the 1960s shifted the federal role from sole producer to stabilizer and buyer of last resort. Conservation wasn't a poster. It meant don't vent if you can pipe it, and don't count on luck to cover strategic programs. Private companies, Air Products, Praxair, and others built refineries along the line because the crude feed would be there and the check would clear. Geography became leverage. The pipeline didn't only move molecules, it moved time. Producers saw a steady sink, users saw a steady source. Spaceflight turned steady into essential. Atlas and Titan families needed helium to pressurize propellant tanks. Purge lines at Cape Canaveral had to stay clean and non-reactive. Cryogenic tests demanded an inert, ultra-cold servant. The helium machine hummed under every headline. By the time MRIs rolled into hospitals, the network already had muscle memory. A doer leaving Liberal, Kansas might cool a superconducting magnet in Seattle 2 days later, and nobody outside the loading dock thought about Texas caverns. Micro story, a technician at Cliffside wrote +12 psi hold on a log at 2:11 a.m. after a Panhandle compressor stumbled. 2 time zones away, a university's NMR magnet took a clean fill. The grad student hit start, and her spectrum came out crisp. She never knew the reserve took the punch. There was a cost hidden in ledgers. The program carried a helium debt. Infrastructure stored gas, decades of operations, valued by methods only appropriators loved, added up to a number that haunted budget hearings. Engineers pointed to uptime graphs, accountants pointed to columns. The compromise would come later: pay down the debt by selling helium, privatize the system, let markets decide. But before anyone pulled that lever, the machine did the job it was built to do. It taught a generation that helium arrived on time because a federal pipeline and a salt cavern made it so. That reliability created habits. Producers invested around the pipe. Distributors promised service windows with a straight face. Hospitals scheduled patients assuming a doer would show before the weekend. Labs planned beam time and builds without backup liquefiers. The buffer wasn't visible, so the risk felt imaginary. The irony is clean. A wartime design built to stop airships from burning ended up underwriting civilian medicine and science for half a century. When that buffer later became an asset to be sold rather than a function to be preserved, the lesson lingered. People still expected the midnight valve to open. The physics hadn't changed. The governance had. The 1996 Helium Privatization Act, signals jammed. The law arrived like housekeeping. Pay back a $1.3 billion helium debt. Shrink Washington's footprint. Let markets handle the rest. Inside the fine print sat the fuse. Interior had to sell most federal helium at a formula price designed to amortize that debt. Not what the molecule was worth on a tight day. What a spreadsheet said it needed to be. The signal that tells investors to build and users to conserve got flattened into a payment plan. Here's what that does to real choices. You're a Rockies gas processor eyeing a helium recovery skid. Capital in the millions. It only pencils if helium holds value for years. But Panhandle barrels are flowing at a formula price that undercuts scarcity. You stall. A university lab asks for a campus liquefier quote. The business office compares it to cheap deliveries and declines. An MRI buyer weighs a zero boil-off premium and says maybe next cycle. A policy aimed at repaying a ledger entry quietly trains the entire chain to ignore risk. Meanwhile, the machine still worked until it didn't. As the mandated sell-down fed cheap molecules into the pipeline, private plants and refiners built schedules around a floor that looked solid. Distributors locked in take-or-pay contracts. Hospitals wrote service agreements pegged to steady refill rates. Labs budgeted helium as if it were oxygen. Then planned maintenance overlapped with unplanned trips. Algeria's Hassi Armel took a turnaround. A U.S. plant tripped. Allocations arrived. Prices spiked, but not in a way that screamed, invest now. They screamed, duck. Behavior lagged the reality. A decade of soft pricing dulled survival instincts. Hospital procurement optimized pennies per liter, not redundancy. Fab managers didn't qualify helium lean recipes until the day they had to. Principal investigators wrote grant timelines that assumed doers would roll like clockwork. Producers who might have built new recovery units looked at a federal competitor emptying its vault on a schedule and thought, why race a subsidized clock? Congress tried to course correct. The 2013 Helium Stewardship Act introduced auctions and a glide path. Keep the pipes running, auction a slice each year to reveal price, and reserve a small cushion for critical users. Bids jumped. Scarcity finally printed on paper. But auctions can't conjure plants that weren't built a decade earlier. Compressors you didn't order in 2004 don't ship in 2014. The Panhandle network still mattered, but its role had shifted. Less public shock absorber, more privatizing utility. Then the squeezes stacked. In 2012-2013, shortage 2 arrived when U.S. outages and Algerian maintenance overlapped. In 2017, the Gulf diplomatic rift strangled Qatar's helium exports for weeks, and roughly a quarter of global supply vanished from the spot market. In 2019, reliability wobbled again. In 2022, a leak at the federal site throttled output just as Russia's invasion scrambled hopes for Amur's new volumes and bent shipping routes into slow arcs that bled boil off. Each event was the kind of hiccup the old reserve used to swallow. Without that buffer, a compressor trip in Texas could echo in a radiology suite in Ohio by Friday. Micro story. At 9:06 a.m., a hospital MRI manager read an allocation email, half the usual fill. She pulled the days list, a pediatric anesthesia slot, stroke follow-ups, and oncology workup. She called facilities to open the freight elevator after midnight pre-chilled transfer lines to cut flash loss and begged a neighboring hospital for 150 liters. The scans happened. The margin was a rumor. The perverse part is that the 1996 law initially kept prices tame. That calm encouraged waste just as the structural cushion thinned. Vent lines stayed open. Recovery projects waited for next year. Semiconductor purge recipes ran fat. When reality broke through, everyone discovered their runway was measured in days. The system didn't fail all at once. It taught fragile habits, then removed the safety net. After auctions nudged prices toward truth, behavior finally moved. Fabs co-funded upstream recovery and installed in-bay reclaim. Universities pooled budgets for campus liquefiers, zero-loss bayonets, and better SOPs. MRI makers leaned into sealed, recondensing designs and serviceable shields. Rocket programs qualified helium lean purge sequences and thicker pads. Each step cost money. Each should have happened years earlier. Price discovery came late. Physics was on time. So what did the law really do? In narrow terms, it paid down the debt and advanced privatization. In system terms, it jammed the feedback loop. A strategic buffer built to stabilize wartime programs became an inventory to be sold at a number divorced from scarcity. Producers delayed. Users overspent on waste and underspent on resilience. When the cupboard was thin, a few valves and weather patterns decided whether a kid's scan slipped a week. The lesson isn't that markets can't manage helium. It's that markets without clean signals and a small, smart buffer will train bad habits, then punish them. The Panhandle still moves molecules. Qatar still rides LNG. Russia still promises tomorrow. But if the price can't say build when it should, and if no public cushion can absorb a routine outage, the countdown will keep freezing at T18 while a tech somewhere hears a magnet whisper minutes. Chokepoint 1, America's Panhandle Pulse. While that law was training bad habits, the Panhandle kept doing quiet hero work. Think of it as a circulatory system more than a pipeline. Crude helium gathered from scattered gas plants, blended and enriched, then fed to refiners that bottle purity into dewars and ISO containers. On a map, it's a thin line from West Texas through Oklahoma into Kansas. In practice, it's a schedule, a memory, and a promise that tomorrow's truck won't show up empty. Because if it does, hospital scans slip and launch windows close. From a producer's perspective, the magic is time shift. Natural gas flows when it flows. Plants go down for a turbine swap, a cold snap, a power spike. The Panhandle network levels that chaos. Pressure management at cliffside and along the line turns choppy daily production into something refineries can plan around. A shift supervisor in Liberal can load pallets knowing the crude feed won't whipsaw with every hiccup 2 states away. That stability is why North American medicine and research lean so hard on Panhandle molecules. Short drive times, predictable dispatch, crews who know hospitals by name. It's a logistics culture as much as a pipe. But the hidden fragility is that the buffer function shrank. The federal role that once absorbed stumbles is now slimmer, privatized, and more exposed to maintenance windows that don't coordinate with your radiology schedule. When a compressor trips in the Panhandle at 3 p.m. on a Thursday and another plant is already in turnaround, allocations can land by Monday. The physics didn't change. The slack did. Get this, weather writes itself into the story. A Panhandle freeze can hammer electricity prices, forcing curtailments at precisely the moment cryogenic compressors need steady power. Summer heat stretches cooling systems and derates throughput. Operators juggle. Bleed pressures here, hold there, prioritize a refiner feeding hospitals over one heavy on industrial demand. That triage happens in real time with phones ringing and SCADA screens blinking. If you work in a Cleveland MRI suite, you only feel it as a vague email that says, "Your delivery will be partial." Meanwhile, aging equipment adds its own roulette. Some of those plants date back decades. Valves that have lived through 1,000 thermal cycles don't fail on a schedule. Sensors drift. Bearings complain. Private owners have improved reliability, swapped out old guts, layered on predictive maintenance. Still, 2 unplanned trips in the wrong week can erase the sense of safety the pipeline used to buy. Micro story. A Friday compressor trip upstream triggered a 48-hour allocation notice across several states. In Colorado, a lab had just commissioned a reclaim skid that morning. They rerouted boil off, banked enough to bridge the weekend, and kept a dilution fridge experiment alive. The Pi said it felt like catching a falling glass with the rim of his shoe. Logistics turns small mistakes into big losses. Every hour a full ISO waits on a hot apron, boil-off climbs. Driver hours caps mean a slip at the plant can cascade into a late-night delivery that misses a hospital's elevator window, pushing the fill a day, bleeding more helium. The best operators stage dry ice, pre-cool lines, and run night fills to dodge traffic and heat. They're not romantic touches, they're survival techniques. What nobody sees is how the Panhandle anchors contract psychology. A buyer in Houston trusts a 2-day lead because the route's been run 1,000 times. Launch teams in Florida time wet dress rehearsals to trucks coming through Oklahoma. University purchasing offices approve smaller safety stock because the Panhandle has been steady. That belief supports thin buffers at the edge, just-in-time behavior built on a system that used to have fat in the middle. Then there's the software of scarcity. Who gets what when supply thins? Medical contracts often carry priority clauses. National labs have framework agreements with carve-outs. Industrial users absorb the first cuts. It's humane on paper, but it adds friction when refineries must re-rack loads, reassign drivers, and call 20 customers to explain. Every replan is a chance for another percentage point of loss. The flip side is how resilience grows from the same geography. Because the network is dense and distances short, recovery investment pays off. Plants add redundant compressors. Refineries upgrade cold boxes and sensors. A small amount of extra storage near the line buys days of cushion. Buyers install reclaim to stretch allocations into steady operation. The Panhandle's greatest weakness, limited slack, is also its greatest opportunity. Small reliability gains ripple fast. Human moment, a cliffside veteran retires after 30 years and tells the new crew, "Don't chase the needle, make the needle chase you." He means pressures. He also means instincts. When a plant upstream wobbles, you don't wait for the phone. You start shaping the flow so the downstream refiner never feels the bump. It's craft, not just controls. Here's where it gets real for end users. If you run a hospital in the Midwest, your helium probably touched that pipe. When maintenance schedules line up wrong, your outage risk rises in days, not weeks. If you install a zero-loss fill protocol and a small recovery bag now, you turn a Thursday allocation into a Friday annoyance instead of a canceled Monday. If you're a fab in Arizona, a modest reclaim loop and helium lean recipe buys independence from Panhandle weather. The Panhandle pulse still sets the North American rhythm. It's a metronome that can drift when 2 beats hit off time. A plant down and a heat wave, a valve swap and a rail delay. The solution isn't to wish for the old reserve back. It's to rebuild function. Reliability upgrades, micro buffers near demand, transparent uptime data, and end-user conservation that shrinks the amplitude of every wobble. When that happens, a compressor trip stays a line item in a control room instead of a whisper in a radiology bay. Chokepoint 2, Qatar's North Field, helium by LNG. While the Panhandle smooths time, Qatar manufactures scale. To see why, start offshore above a blue horizon that hides the North Field, one of the largest single accumulations of natural gas on Earth, part of the same reservoir Iran calls South Pars. The genius wasn't that the gas was rich in helium. It was. The genius was welding helium extraction onto some of the world's cheapest, steadiest LNG trains and letting volume do the math. Because when those trains pause, clinics and fabs and ocean away feel it. Here's how the day actually runs. Feed gas flows from the field into a complex that looks like a small city. Separation, dehydration, fractionation, refrigeration, the mile of pipe you'll never tour. Helium hitches a ride in tiny concentrations. Strip it early and you waste cold. Strip it late and you lose recovery. Qatar's Helium-1 and Helium-2 plants sit where the thermodynamics favor capture, pulling helium off as the LNG process steps down temperatures and pressures. A cryogenic column does precision work. Compressors push, cold boxes hum. Out comes crude helium, then refined, then liquid loading into ISO containers that look like white, square boats of frost. Why it matters is simple: throughput. When your LNG trains move ocean-scale volumes every day, even parts per million helium becomes serious tonnage. Costs spread across a balanced, export-driven machine. That's how Qatar vaulted to top exporter status: low marginal cost, high reliability, and ships leaving constantly. Asia's fabs buy contracts that ride this metronome. European buyers hedge Panhandle risk with Qatari volumes. The spot market calms when these trains run like clockwork. but tie your helium to LNG and you inherit LNG's calendar. A planned turnaround on a train, 30 to 45 days, means helium goes dark with it. You do inventory choreography, build stock ahead, pre-position containers, hope nothing else trips. When the 2017 Gulf diplomatic rift hit, airspace and land routes pinched. Helium moved by sea eventually, but the pause revealed the fragility. You can have the cold boxes humming and still lose days to paperwork, port calls, and boil-off in the heat. Micro story, a buyer in Taiwan watched a buffer tick down, 9 days, 7-5. A rerouted ISO slipped through alternate ports and rolled into the yard 2 days before a purge gas changeover would have forced idles. The plant manager didn't send a memo. He walked the etch bay and told the night shift, "We made it." Then he signed a contract that split future volumes across 2 suppliers. Zoom into the plant floor and you see a different discipline, uptime by ritual. Operators live by turnaround plans measured in years. Spares are stocked in multiples. Bearings and sensors get swapped before they squeal. Helium units aren't the main show against LNG revenue, but they're integrated enough that a helium trip can complicate a train's rhythm. The fix is cultural as much as mechanical. Treat helium as a first-class citizen. In recent years, Qatar invested like that. Larger units, better redundancy, cleaner logistics paths. The payoff is global. Fewer scrambles for radiology chiefs in Paris when one pump falters in Ras Laffan. Contracts carry their own physics. Long-term offtake stabilizes both sides, buyers lock price bands and volumes, producers plan maintenance with less drama. But that stability can lull. If 2 trains schedule overlapping maintenance and a third takes a hiccup, allocations ripple across continents. In hot months, every extra day an ISO sits at a transshipment port bleeds product. The smart shippers game the sun, late-night loadouts, fast clearance, cold staging near the quay. A half degree saved at the dock translates to liters in a hospital 2 weeks later. Meanwhile, growth looms. North Field expansion promises more LNG and by extension more helium capacity. That sounds like salvation, but commissioning is where cryo plants learn humility. A turbo expander vibrates wrong, a control loop fights a ghost, a weld weeps at cold. One unit offline for weeks tightens a market that assumed it would be there. The right way to plan is boring. Treat new Qatari tons as upside until they've run a boring 6 months. Procurement teams that forget that end up writing frantic emails to labs. Human moment, a Ras Laffan operator keeps a Polaroid of his son's chest X-ray taped near the HMI screen. He jokes it's why he double-checks set points. He's not kidding. He understands a drift here lands in a clinic there. There's one more angle, politics at sea level. Shipping lanes, insurance, port access. Small policy changes can add days to voyages and liters to loss. The 2017 rift was a master class in how non-technical constraints throttle a technical system. After that, Qatar diversified routes and partners, baked detours into schedules, and invested in additional ISO fleets. It's hedging you can see, rows of white containers like reserve pawns on a chessboard. For end users, the translation is straightforward. If you're an Asian fab, sync your maintenance to Qatar's published LNG turnarounds, build a buffer ahead of those windows. If you're a European hospital, blend Panhandle and Qatari contracts so one outage doesn't cut you to the bone. If you run logistics, obsess over dwell time in hot ports as much as price per liter. Qatar can carry the world far until the day it can't for a month. The winners act before the calendar does. Qatar's edge is the math of scale and the culture of uptime. Its weakness is shared fate with LNG and with geopolitics that don't care about your appointment book. When it hums, the helium world breathes easier. When it pauses, you hear the echo in countdown clocks and MRI suites half a planet away. Chokepoint 3, Russia's Amur/Yamal, promise and delay. Unknown to many buyers planning their budgets, a new giant was supposed to arrive from the east and make shortages boring. The plan had a name and a map: Siberia to the far east, gas processing at Amur near Svobodny, and rail lines carrying white, frost-rimmed ISO containers toward Pacific ports. Add in western Siberia's Yamal gas streams, and you had a narrative: Russia as the third stabilizer after the Panhandle and Qatar. If Amur ran steady, the market would finally have slack, and your MRI date, your chip supply, and your countdown would stop living on hope. On paper, Amur looked like a turning point. Multiple processing trains, each designed to peel helium from gas streams en route to petrochemical customers and pipelines to China. Dedicated helium liquefaction, storage spheres, a container loading yard. The logistics model was unusual. Not ships leaving a coastal terminal, but long, cold rail hauls across thousands of kilometers to Vladivostok or other ports, then sea legs to Korea, Japan, and beyond. It was bold, capital-heavy, and if it worked, a swing factor big enough to tame the spot market. Here's the part that mattered to end users. Contracts and calendars were written assuming certain trains would be online by certain dates. Suppliers told hospitals, fabs, and labs, relief is coming. Procurement teams marked quarters on spreadsheets when allocations might loosen. Process engineers paused reclamation projects believing new tons would make the math easier. The system shifted its hopes east. Then the commissioning reality set in. Cryogenics is unforgiving. A turboexpander wobbles, a control algorithm hunts, a weld that looked fine at ambient weeps at 4 Kelvin. Early units cycled through starts and stops, producing then pausing. Each pause was a ripple, a supplier expecting railcars on Wednesday rebooked Friday flights, a hospital that planned a normal fill got a partial. The promise didn't evaporate, it slipped by weeks, then months, then quarters. And then 2022 rewired everything. Sanctions bit in strange places. Bearings, sealants, control software patches, the small parts that keep big machines boring became procurement puzzles. Insurance for certain routes went thin. Export paperwork turned political. Some modules at Amur suffered incidents. Timelines stretched as investigations and repairs moved at a pace set by geopolitics as much as engineering. If you were counting on Amur's 3rd or 4th unit to stabilize your quarter, you started rewriting plans on a Sunday night. Yamal's role added both potential and ambiguity. Western Siberia's gas universe is vast, and helium-bearing streams exist, but the post-2022 pivot of Russian gas logistics, away from Europe, toward Asia, scrambled priorities. Building out helium recovery where the main business model was rerouting pipeline gas is hard to justify when every spare ruble an hour is triage. The net effect wasn't zero, but it wasn't the steady march the market had penciled in. Micro story. A supplier's quarterly deck showed 2 Amur trains at 80% and 60% capacity, with a 3rd entering hot commissioning. A week later, a valve fault forced a cold box warm up. The 60% train dipped to 0 for 9 days. An R&D customer in the Netherlands lost a dilution fridge run and rewrote the semester's schedule. The supplier's rep, voice tired, said, "We'll reallocate from Asia," and then had to yank those leaders back when a port hold hit. The rail-to-sea chain introduced its own helium tax. Time. Every extra day on tracks or in a port apron is boil-off you can't reclaim. In winter, Siberian air helps a bit. In summer, coastal heat eats inventory. Smart operators staged cold transfer pads, insulated better, and choreographed handoffs at night. Even so, the long supply line made Amur's helium expensive in a currency more precious than money: reliability. Yet the lure remained. If fully commissioned with reliable spares and clear logistics, Amur's multi-train design could provide the modular redundancy the market craves. 1 unit trips, 2 stay up, and the rail yard keeps loading. The problem was never physics alone. It was the intersection where physics meets politics meets procurement. After 2022, that intersection turned into a maze. Buyers adapted. Contracts started to treat Russian volumes as upside, not baseline. Asian fabs leaned harder into Qatar with stricter dwell time clauses. European hospitals blended Panhandle and Middle East sources and pushed vendors for zero-loss fill protocols. University purchasing groups stopped waiting and funded reclaim. Everyone learned a rule that should have been obvious: don't build your schedule on a plant you haven't seen run through a boring summer. Human moment. A scheduler in Khabarovsk watched a screen of container IDs and ambient temps and called a yard foreman to pull 3 cars into shade while a customs issue stalled paperwork. He saved a few hundred liters no patient will ever thank him for. He did it anyway. So where does Russia sit now? As promised still. As relief sometimes. As a dependable 3rd metronome, not yet. Commissioning continues, workarounds accumulate, and some volumes do flow. But the lesson travels faster than the containers. Treat new capacity as bonus until it's proven through a full maintenance cycle, a winter, a summer, and a geopolitical squall. If it passes that test, the helium world breathes out. Until then, plan like the countdown might hold, and the magnet might whisper minutes. What shortages feel like? Hospitals and MRIs. The first sign is a sound. A high-field magnet that's been quiet for years gives a thin metallic squeal as the bath warms a fraction. The charge nurse doesn't know what that means, the MRI tech does. She checks the helium gauge, glances at the delivery board, and sees a red note, allocation partial fill only. Her next patients are a stroke follow-up, a sedated pediatric case, and an oncology staging. The helium isn't a budget line anymore, it's triage. In radiology, time runs in 30-minute blocks. Helium runs in liters per day. When the numbers fight, people move. Facilities call security to hold a service elevator after midnight. The vendor can make a partial drop at 2:10 a.m., but only if the dock is clear and the transfer lines are cold. Two techs pull on gloves and start a ritual they learned the hard way. Purge the couplers with cold gas, pre-chill the vacuum-jacketed hose until frost traces the braid, open the magnet's fill port 1/4 turn. They talk in short sentences because waste has a sound, sharp hissing, and once you hear it, you never forget it. Micro story, at 1:57 a.m. the doer valve sticks. A tech breathes out, not in, to keep her hands steady. She wrenches, it breaks free, the line flashes cold, and the helium rush drops into a steady whisper. She checks the boil-off meter, lower than last time. That margin just bought a pediatric anesthesia slot at 9:00. The public thinks of MRIs as machines. The staff thinks of them as patients with moods. Each magnet has a personality. One drifts warm on humid days, one hates floor vibrations, one loses a liter an hour if a door seal is tired. In a shortage, those quirks become risks. The manager keeps a whiteboard with handwritten boil-off rates. If she doesn't have that number for each scanner, she's bleeding in the dark. When allocations hit, the board decides which magnet stays cold and which one will be idled and gently warmed. A choice nobody likes to make because a warm magnet is a rebuild waiting to happen. Here's the part you never see in marketing. A zero boil-off scanner still breathes. The recondensing unit can catch most evaporation, but it needs maintenance windows, clean cryocoolers, and service access that hospitals often schedule like an afterthought. In tight weeks, those windows vanish. A tech postpones a service call because the vendor can't guarantee parts, then loses more helium to a shield that should have been swapped. The invoice looks smaller today and larger in 6 months. Meanwhile, the waiting room fills with human stakes. A woman with a fresh stent needs an urgent check for a clot she can't feel. A kid with seizures has been fasting since midnight for sedation. A man who stayed silent for a year finally told his doctor about the pain in his spine. They don't know what helium does. They only know the scanner door stayed closed yesterday, and the receptionist used the word reschedule. When supply thins, hospitals improvise alliances. A downtown facility with 2 scanners calls a suburban partner with one and asks to borrow a doer, promising to return the favor on the next squeeze. Drivers meet at the halfway point, trade paperwork in a parking lot, and transfer precious cold with hands that move like watchmakers. A liter saved in transit is an appointment kept at dawn. Technique becomes policy. The night shift rewrites SOPs. 2-person fills only, log every transfer, pre-cool every line, 0 lost bayonets or no fill. Facilities installs a small recovery bag in the vent line, nothing fancy, just enough to catch boil off overnight and feed a compressor skid that came on a rental truck. The captured gas goes into storage cylinders. It's not a full loop, but it takes the edge off, and in a shortage, the edge is where cancellations live. Micro story, a rural hospital without a service contract got a 300-liter allocation instead of 800. The radiology director called a retired engineer who volunteers at the clinic. He walked in with a coil of vacuum-jacketed line and a bag of new gaskets, found 3 tiny leaks in the fill path, and cut losses by a third. The next week's cancer scans stayed on the calendar. And when the worst happens, when a magnet warms enough to threaten a quench, the room changes temperature without the thermostat moving. Staff clear the area, the tech hits a checklist that was written for emergencies no one expected to meet, and warm gas screams through the quench pipe to the roof. Afterward, there's silence. Refill is days away, rebuild is months. Surgeons reroute, neurologists switch to CT and accept what they can't see, and the finance office writes a number that doesn't capture the missed diagnoses. This is what helium shortage feels like inside a hospital. Not headlines, but small decisions stacked at 2 a.m. Not theory, but wrist steady over frost. Not balloons, but a child waking up on time because a tech shaved 2% off a loss nobody else noticed. Fabs on a helium diet, process and reclaim. From a hospital corridor to a cleanroom aisle, the sound changes, but the stakes feel similar. In Fabs, helium is invisible plumbing for yield. It cushions plasmas in etch and PECVD, purges oxygen from chambers, and carries heat out of parts that can't afford a scratch, let alone a spark. When allocations hit 70% or 60%, the line doesn't stop. Engineers start counting atoms. First move, find the fat without breaking physics. A staff meeting in a 28 nm bay turns into a triage board. Which steps are helium critical for uniformity? Which purges are superstition from a tool recipe written in 2011? They pull logs, overlay defect maps, and circle 3 candidates. Chamber idle purges, wafer to wafer sweep time, and pump down margins that were padded during a bad week years ago. The new rule isn't slash, qualify. Micro story. A process engineer named Anita walks a notebook down tool 43's row at 3:12 a.m. She kills a 10-second idle purge, replaces it with a nitrogen co-flow for non-critical steps, and extends the pump down by 6 seconds. The first 5 wafers show no drift in line edge roughness. She lets 10 more run, then opens the SPC chart with a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Stable. She's just cut net helium flow 20% on that chamber without moving the defect baseline. Then comes the harder part, closing the loop. Reclaim turns exhaust into feedstock. You start by mapping where helium exits. 4 lines from etch clusters, roughing pumps on PECVD, tool vents that dump cooled purge gas. Lines get rerouted into a stainless header, and a skid the size of a delivery van takes the stream from there. Pre-filters for particles and acids, a dryer to strip moisture, a membrane stage to push nitrogen and hydrogen aside, then a PSA or cryo swing that upgrades helium to a purity the house spec will accept. A small buffer tank smooths the burps. A compressor lifts pressure to the plant header. It sounds neat in a brochure. In practice, reclaim is choreography. 4-line valves chatter. Maintenance pops a flange and dumps an hour's worth of capture to atmosphere if you didn't write lockouts into SOPs. Chemical byproducts from exotic chemistries poison membranes if you miss a filter change. The winning Fabs treat the skid like a tool. Owner, PM schedule, SPC on purity and flow. When purity dips, a light blinks on a screen in the same control room that watches focus and dose. The math is stubborn but rewarding. An in-bay loop capturing 60% of purge exhaust might return 40% net after losses. If helium is $30 per 1,000 standard cubic feet today and twice that tomorrow, the payback tightens every allocation. A pilot on one etch cluster becomes 2 clusters, then a bay. Procurement shifts from arguing unit price to hammering uptime guarantees and membrane replacement schedules into the vendor's contract. Micro story. A night shift tech named Jorge hears a hiss near the reclaim header that wasn't there yesterday. He puts a hand on a clamp, feels the cold bite, and calls maintenance. They find a hairline cut in a gasket that looks fine at room temp and leaks at 10 torr. 20 minutes later, the hiss is gone. The skid's flow meter climbs back 3 points. It's nothing on paper. It's a week of buffer inventory over a quarter. Recipes evolve alongside plumbing. Nitrogen co-flow where chemistry allows. Helium lean plasma steps proven by DOE instead of hunch. Chamber seasoning redesigned to use helium only at the edge where micro-arcing was an issue. Metrology backs it up. Scatterometry shows no thickness drift. CD-SEM stay boring and reliability pulls don't flinch. Where helium can't move, ultra-high aspect vias, brittle low-K films, it stays. Everywhere else it trims. Scheduling is a lever too. Pre-purge and season during night power valleys. Batch helium-intensive layers so the reclaim skid runs steady instead of spiky. Stage pre-purged spare chambers so a tool swap doesn't start from warm metal. Align tool maintenance with supplier deliveries so you don't waste fresh helium seeding O-rings on a day the truck is late. Suppliers meet you halfway when you meet them in writing. Contracts tie a slice of volume to uptime at an upstream helium recovery plant the Fab helped pay for. When the plant trips, liquid nitrogen credits kick in to backfill less critical purge steps. When Qatar announces a turnaround, the Fab's calendar already shows a 2-week helium diet with recipes on the shelf, not in a draft email. Human moment, the yield lead brings donuts to the reclaim team on a Tuesday nobody will remember. He points at the bay's big screen. Return flow nudged up 2% after a membrane swap. That 2% is $20,000 a week and 3 days of safety stock no one will panic about next month. He tells them thanks. He means it. The culture change is the real product. Helium stops being the gas we've always used and becomes a parameter with owners, charts, and contingency plans. The Fab learns to diet without starving. Reclaim what you can, prove where you can't, and write your next quarter so a missed train in Texas or a hot week in Ras-Laffan becomes a line item, not a line stoppage. Labs, neutron sources, and quantum, survival technique. Meanwhile, on the other side of the calendar, science runs on windows you can't shift. Beam time at a neutron source gets booked a year ahead. And when your week arrives, the reactor or spallation source doesn't wait for your helium truck. Cooling stages don't care about excuses. A dilution refrigerator needs a ladder of cold that bottoms near millikelvin. Miss the fill and your experiment warms 5 degrees that might as well be 5 miles. Walk into a Neutron hall at dawn. The floor hums with pumps, the air smells faintly of clean metal and vacuum grease. A postdoc checks a superfluid bath level, taps a glass column, and watches a meniscus crawl. The bath is helium at 2K, flowing like a ghost through channels so thin they look imaginary. She doesn't think about poetry. She's thinking about a leak she traced last week to a compression fitting that tightened beautifully at room temperature and side open at cold. She swapped the ferrule, logged the torque, and added one more line to a binder titled Losses. Micro story: 3 nights into a protein dynamics run, a shipment stuck at port shaved the facility's buffer to hours. A beamline scientist pulled a dusty roll of vacuum-jacketed line from storage, purged it with cold gas, and replumbed a bypass that cut 2 transfer steps. The leaders saved turned into 4 hours of data the instrument team had promised a visiting PI for a grant milestone. The PI bought the hall pizza. The team filed a permanent change request. Survival is plumbing with manners. The best labs map every cold path like a subway diagram. Source doer to plant header, header to liquefier, liquefier to storage, storage to instrument, instrument to recovery bag, bag to compressor, compressor to purifier, purifier back to liquefier. Each node has a number: loss rate, pressure drop, wait time. If a number is unknown, it's a leak by another name. They replace rubber where metal will do, swap compression fittings for welded joints where practical, and train grad students to handle bayonet connectors as if they were surgical instruments. Recycling is no longer a pilot, it's religion. Boil-off feeds a bag or bellows that won't collapse and suck contaminants. A screw compressor lifts pressure into cylinders, a dryer strips water, activated charcoal takes oils, a getter or PSA cleans what sneaks through. The liquefier is the drummer, steady power, steady speed, a logbook of oil changes and cold box hours. When the grid wobbles, a UPS buys minutes to land the machine gracefully. When maintenance shuts a valve upstream, captured helium lets the cryostat breathe without a panic call. Technique scales with stakes. Dilution fridges for quantum chips are Torah-forced humility. Pulse tube coolers thrum, stills condense, heat leaks hide in wiring that looks like art and behaves like a thief. Each coaxial line into a qubit stage is a potential radiator. Teams add attenuators and filters not only for RF hygiene but for thermal gradients. They preload heat sinks, stagger thermalization stages, and audit every connector for bite marks that mean someone over-tightened at room temperature and guaranteed a warm surprise at 10 mK. Micro story: a quantum group lost a Tuesday when a new student clipped a braid wrong and turned a millikelvin stage into a 700 mK heater. The PI didn't yell. He pulled out a laminated card, cold handling rules. They rebuilt the harness with softer bends, retorque to spec, and etched a tiny "do not twist" arrow near a connector only gloved hands would see. Helium loss dropped. The fridge hit base an hour faster the next run. Neutron facilities run different but rhyme. Cold sources feed on liquid hydrogen or deuterium, but the downstream cryogenics lean on helium to move heat where pumps can't. Here, uptime is national, not departmental. A valves and bearings list sits next to a schedule that reads like a train timetable. When a plant schedules a hydrogen moderator maintenance, the helium team shifts their PM into that shadow so both lines return together. The goal is boring. Boring means the user office doesn't send, regret to inform you, emails, and the instruments don't live as exhibits. Data culture closes the loop. Labs that survive shortages post dashboards no one would expect in a physics building. Daily helium balance, liquefier OEE, recovery yield, instrument loss ranking. Red cells start conversations. A magnet with a suspicious boil-off spikes. The cryostat tech visits with an IR gun and a stethoscope's worth of intuition. A compressor's current creeps. Bearings next week, not next month. They treat helium like a budget and like blood. Human moment: a cryo lead keeps a cheap helium balloon tied over a vent stack. If it droops at noon, something's wrong. It's not calibrated, it's not fancy, and it saves leaders a year by starting arguments at the right time. The new rule is simple and hard. Plan like your truck won't arrive, build loops that forgive mistakes, and train hands until a frosted bayonet and a silent leak are loud as alarms. You don't win shortages, you out-technique them. Rockets without room for error. From neutron halls to the pad, helium changes uniforms but keeps the same job. quiet insurance against chaos. On a launch vehicle, it does three unforgiving things: pressurizes propellant tanks as cryogenic liquids shrink, purges lines so no oxygen fuel mix lurks where it shouldn't, and feeds pneumatic systems that must answer instantly. Miss any of those, and the countdown clock freezes while 100 people stare at a single stubborn valve. Here's the rhythm under the drama. As liquid oxygen chills tanks to cryo temperatures, the volume collapses and pressure falls. Helium, stored at high pressure in composite overwrapped pressure vessels, backfills the space to hold tanks within tight limits. Too little and ullage pressure dips, starving turbopumps later. Too much and structural margins get tested. The same gas scours lines ahead of propellant flows, clearing moisture and debris, then keeps the plumbing inert while valves cycle. It's a choreography measured in seconds where close enough is. Micro story: a mid-size launcher sat at T130 upper stage, helium trending low. A controller called hold, the clock stopped at T112. They ran a rapid top-off on the ground umbilical, stabilized the curve, and recycled. The payload flew 2 days later. The press conference said out of family data. On the loop, they said, we almost starved the stage. Even the hardware reminds you why helium is non-negotiable. Those composite tanks have histories written in tiny design choices: liner wrinkles, fiber layup, oxygen behavior in cold cavities. After a high-profile accident years back, fueling procedures and COPV designs changed to keep solid oxygen away from surfaces where friction could light a fire. Helium loading profiles got rewritten. Temperature ramps became religion. What sounds like paperwork is really survival. Keep helium cold enough, loaded late enough, and isolated from LOX behaviors that don't forgive optimism. Ground support lives on helium too. Pad umbilicals hiss with inert gas before cryoflows begin. Launch commit criteria include leak-back checks that depend on a reliable helium push. A tiny miss shows up as a pressure decay that trips a limit, and the sequencer halts. The public hears pneumatic issue. In the blockhouse, someone is tapping a pressure plot and tracing the exact minute a regulator drifted. Allocations land here with teeth. When supply tightens, launch providers rewrite sequences to reduce helium mass. Pre-purge with nitrogen where chemistry allows, finish with helium. Widen tolerances on non-critical purges. Qualify longer pump downs. Carry more helium margin on the vehicle to buy independence from a late tanker. It's all acceptable, until you find the one step where nitrogen won't do, because a trace of oxygen would bite an igniter or frost a sensor that can't tolerate a speck of water. Micro story: a startup on the coast faced a 40% cut a week before wet dress. The team split the rehearsal. Day 1 ran cryo tanking with nitrogen pre-purge. Day 2 reserved helium for engine spin and final line conditioning. They slipped 3 days, shaved helium mass 30%, and flew the following week. The chief engineer wrote a note on the whiteboard: compress entropy early. The logistics mirror hospitals and fabs, just louder. ISOs staged near the pad bleed if the sun sits on them. A thunderstorm pushes roll out, and a day of boil-off becomes someone's rescheduled date with a launch window. Smart pads stage shade, pre-cool transfer lines, and run night operations. A half degree of heat saved before a fill becomes a percentage point of margin at T. Culture is the guardrail. Launch teams run anomaly boards where helium sits on the first page, even when nothing's wrong. They track bottle pressures like heartbeats. They simulate holds at random points to prove the stack can detank and retank with today's helium inventories, not theoretical ones. They keep a pair of emergency high-purity cylinder racks plumbed to pad pneumatics, not as Plan A, but as a lifeline when a truck blows a tire an hour up the highway. Human moment: a pad operator keeps a dog-eared card in his pocket, purge sequences, pressures, crack open values. On bad days, he rubs a greased thumb over one line: helium is forgiveness you brought with you. It's a joke, that is, because rockets don't forgive, procedures do. And here's the quiet twist: every improvement here feeds back upstream. Helium lean purges reduce demand spikes that smash refineries. Better shade and faster turn pads cut boil off that no policy can print back into a tank. The space program learns to live on less helium not because it wants to, but because it doesn't have a choice. The payoff is a launch that proceeds when the clock says go, and a hospital that never hears that metallic squeal the same week. The economics of scarcity: pricing, hoarding, and behavior. When helium turns from background utility to front-page problem, money stops being abstract. Price is supposed to carry truth. Scarce equals expensive. Expensive equals conserve. Conserved equals stable. But with helium, the signal arrives late, distorted, or not at all. That's how you get a hospital CFO negotiating pennies per liter while a tech loses liters per fill, and a fab delaying a reclaim skid that would have paid itself back in one shortage. Start with how price moves. The contract world lives in multi-year terms with escalation clauses. The spot world lives in weeks and panic. When a plant trips or an LNG train turns down, spot prices spike, then sag when a shipment lands. That volatility doesn't tell producers build as cleanly as you'd think. To green light recovery on a gas field, you need a long, boring high price, not a jagged chart. Meanwhile, end users feel the spikes fast. Allocations arrive, surcharges appear, and someone at a loading dock starts counting doers like ration cards. Micro story, a distributor's salesperson called a physics department with bad news, 15% surcharge immediate. The chair grumbled, then said yes, beam time was next month. 2 years earlier, the same chair rejected a campus liquefier because the payback looked too long. The surcharge alone would have paid the note. Hoarding creeps in when trust drains out. A hospital that lived fine with a week of buffer suddenly wants 3. A fab doubles safety stock in summer because last July hurt. Those extra ISOs sitting in yards and corridors aren't free. They bleed, boil off, and tie up supplier fleets. One buyer's comfort becomes another buyer's cancellation. It feels rational individually and irrational system-wide. Classic tragedy of commons, except the commons is a cryogenic supply chain that leaks under sunlight. Suppliers fight that with contracts and carrots. Take or pay terms anchor base loads. Priority clauses favor medical and national security customers. In calm months, this keeps trucks rooted and plants humming. In tight months, it creates triage lists and hard calls. A research lab gets cut to keep an oncology schedule whole. A startup's test slips so a national lab can run a time-critical instrument. Nobody loves the calls. Everyone knows they're necessary. Price transparency is another missing limb. LNG turnarounds are announced. Helium impacts often aren't. Pipeline pressures and plant uptime hide behind corporate PR. Without clear dials, storage levels, production rates, buyers substitute rumor for planning. That's how speculative hoarding starts. Someone heard Qatar's train will slip. Someone else read a forum post about Amur restarting. A purchasing office quietly doubles its order just in case. The resulting drawdown makes the rumor true. Micro story, a European hospital network placed duplicate orders through 2 distributors under different ship-to names. A driver recognized the dock and called his dispatch. The second delivery got reassigned to a university on rations. The network's procurement lead later admitted the trick. He didn't apologize, he said he had a NICU. Scarcity also exposes cross-subsidies. Balloon gas subsidized by commodity deliveries evaporates as party customers dry up or get shamed out of line. Industrial users who once took cuts quietly now demand parity as their contracts fatten. Meanwhile, the heaviest social value, medicine, doesn't always carry the fattest margin. Suppliers thread needles. Higher price bands on non-critical industrial accounts, tiered increases that spare hospitals until the last moment, and project financing for reclaim kits so buyers can spend capex instead of opex. Behavior shifts when price turns from number to narrative. A fab that used to treat helium as the standard now holds weekly helium stand-ups with SPC charts on reclaim return. A hospital ties executive bonuses to boil-off reduction targets. A university adds a line in every grant template, helium risk mitigation plan. The point isn't shame, it's ownership. When people own the loss curve, they move it. Then there's the investment logic upstream. Recovery at gas plants competes with other uses of capital in companies that don't sell helium as their core business. If helium revenue doesn't look reliable, the project loses to a bottleneck on ethane or a sulfur unit overhaul. Price floors help, but only if they're credible. That's why auction signals matter more than speeches. A run of strong auction clears says, build, you'll get paid. A policy that backs recovery with tax credits or accelerated depreciation says, build, we'll share risk. Beware the mirage of cheap forever. Formula pricing taught users to believe in it. Auctions corrected it slowly. Geopolitics corrected it brutally. The healthy state isn't constant pain, it's visible scarcity. When the dial is public, how much helium sits in storage, how much is flowing, how long the outage might last. Buyers can right-size buffers instead of hoarding. Suppliers can schedule maintenance without triggering panics. And investors can read a signal that survives a news cycle. Human moment, A radiology manager who once begged for partial fills now runs a dashboard on a wall TV. Magnet boil-off, doer ETA, reclaim capture. The CFO walks by, sees green, and stops asking why the helium line is up this quarter. The answer is on screen. A mild surcharge, a tiny hoard avoided, a habit changed. The economics of helium scarcity are less about a single high price and more about trust, timing, and technique. Price opens the door, behavior walks through it. When the signal is honest and the habits are tight, helium stays where it matters and moves when it should. When it isn't and they aren't, the world pays in nights and noise, hissing away a gas we can't replace. Real fixes, demand side first. We can't print new helium. We can only stop losing the helium we already have. That starts at the fill port with habits that look small and add up to lifetimes of uptime. Rule 1, measure before you preach. If you don't know your loss curve, you don't have a plan. Hospitals log real boil-off per magnet, not brochure numbers. Fabs post helium mass flow per tool and per layer. Labs track recovery yield by instrument. A single dashboard changes behavior faster than a scolding email ever will. Then attack transfers. Every fill is a leak waiting to happen if the metal is warm and the fittings are tired. Switch to vacuum-jacketed lines with true zero-loss bayonets. Pre-cool lines with cold helium gas until the frost ring tells you they're ready. Replace O-rings before they fail, not after. Mandate two-person fills. A second set of eyes pays back in liters. Micro story, a night tech at a community hospital added a 60-second pre-cool to the magnet fill routine and swapped 2 aging gaskets. Their next delivery lasted 8 days longer. No memo, no budget meeting, just a checklist edit. Close the loop wherever physics allows. For hospitals and universities, that means capture, compress, clean, reliquefy. Start simple. A recovery bag on the vent line that won't collapse or suck contaminants, a screw compressor with proper filtration, and a purifier that catches oils and water before they poison a liquefier. Scale when you can. A 2040 L/HR liquefier turns drip feed recovery into a steady drumbeat of cold. The key is ownership. Someone who treats the skid like a mission-critical instrument with PMs, spare parts, and a logbook. Fabs need reclaim at the bay level, not down the hall. Map your helium exits. Plumb 4 lines and vents into a stainless header. Install staged cleanup, particulate acid gas, moisture, before membranes and PSA. Tie the skid's purity and flow to SPC like any other tool. When purity drifts, the same alarm that calls a metrology tech should ping the reclaim owner. Schedule maintenance windows so reclaim doesn't get bypassed for a day that becomes a month. Recipes earn their keep when they're proven, not assumed. Run designed experiments to carve helium out of purge steps that never deserved it. Idle purges, wafer-to-wafer sweeps, overcooked chamber seasoning. Where nitrogen can pre-purge, let it, then finish with helium for critical layers. For the steps that truly require helium's inert calm, keep it rich and tight. Publish the data so the next shortage doesn't send the line into folklore. Scheduling is a silent lever. Batch helium-intensive tasks. Stage pre-purged spare chambers. Align deliveries with night fills to dodge elevator traffic and summer heat. In research halls, synchronize magnet fills across labs so a single long transfer feeds many instead of many short ones bleeding separately. Small harmonies turn into real leaders. Micro story, a university physics building installed a shared recovery header on a $12,000 grant no one thought would matter. 3 labs tied in. 6 months later, their liquid purchases fell by 2/3. The PI who fought the line item now brags about it to visitors. Upgrade smart, not flashy. In medicine, move toward sealed, recondensing Mr. Magnets, retrofit shields, audit quench pipes, add serviceable cryocoolers you can actually maintain on Tuesdays, not someday. In labs, replace rubber with welded stainless where possible, insulate aggressively, fix the one warm elbow you always meant to fix. In fabs, add point-of-use mass flow verification and leak-back checks so a tiny drift doesn't become a month of waste. Train hands until they're steady at 3 a.m. right cold handling sops that real people use. Laminate them. Make new staff fill under supervision 10 times before they fly solo. Do short debriefs after every tricky transfer. What hissed, what frosted late, what felt off. In cleanrooms, give reclaim the same pride of place as the flagship litho tool. In hospitals, put helium loss reduction on the monthly safety huddle agenda. In labs, add cryo discipline to the first-year curriculum. Contracts can push good behavior. Ask suppliers for zero-loss delivery commitments and route plans that minimize dwell on hot aprons. Tie a slice of your volume to an upstream recovery plant's uptime that you co-funded. Publish the metrics. Negotiate maintenance calendars against known LNG turnarounds. Prioritize reliability clauses over chasing a nickel per liter you'll waste in a bad fill. Micro story. A European hospital system wrote a tender that awarded points for suppliers who could demonstrate average dock to bay dwell under 90 minutes and night fill capacity. 2 vendors rewired dispatch to win. The hospital's boil-off dropped 5% before any hardware changed. Make hoarding obsolete by making buffers smart. Tiny on-site micro storage near the point of use. An extra chilled dewar, a small sphere for reclaimed gas, beats a yard full of warm ISOs bleeding in the sun. Share buffers where trust is possible. Hospital pairs that loan each other liters, university consortia with pooled dewars and liquefiers, fab campuses that balance reclaim across bays. Finally, publish your dials. Internally, a wall screen with magnet boil-off, reclaim yield next ETA. With partners, a simple monthly note, losses trending down, capture trending up, maintenance scheduled here. Scarcity thrives on opacity. Technique thrives on visibility. We can't make helium. We can stop losing it. Demand-side fixes don't wait for politics or new plants. They live in checklists, gaskets, headers, sops, and habits that turn midnight hisses into quiet rooms where work gets done. Rebuilding supply resilience without repeating 1996. To rebuild without teaching the wrong lessons again, start with 2 rails, honest signals, and a small, smart buffer. Not a giant stockpile you can raid with a formula price. A living machine that stabilizes the sickest days without masking scarcity on the healthy ones. Price signals first. Auctions need to be frequent, transparent, and sized to reveal reality, not to meet a spreadsheet target. Monthly clears with forward strips 6 to 12 months out let producers see a runway and let users plan upgrades. Publish volumes cleared, bid depth, and delivery windows. When prices rise before a turnaround, conservation begins before panic does. When prices soften after a new train proves reliability, reclamation keeps paying because people locked the capex on a credible curve, not a rumor. Now the buffer. Think Reserve 2. Modest in size, mission-bound, and digitally visible. A handful of regional caverns or spheres tied to critical corridors, filled through auctions at market prices, released by rule when defined thresholds hit. A set percentage drop in pipeline pressure, a verified multi-train LNG outage, or a declared national emergency in medicine or launch. Every withdrawal posts to a public dashboard with remaining days of cover. Every refill clears through the same market that set the price. The buffer smooths shocks, it doesn't subsidize waste. Micro story, a winter freeze knocks 2 Panhandle plants. The buffer triggers a 10-day draw at midnight. Hospitals in 5 states get normal fills. Research allocations slip by 15% instead of 50%. The dashboard shows the dip and the refill schedule. Procurement officers don't hoard because they can see the dials. Make data boring and public. A monthly helium state of flow is table stakes. Major plant uptime percentages, planned LNG turnarounds with helium impacts, pipeline pressures, storage fill levels, ISO fleet availability, and average port dwell times in hot months. No trade secrets, just enough visibility for scheduling sanity. When everyone can see a 3-week maintenance window coming, Fabs pre-batch, hospitals move service calls, and labs align beam time with reality instead of hope. Tie money to conservation where molecules are saved. Grants and tax credits should land at the fill port. Zero-loss hardware for hospitals, campus liquefiers for universities, reclaim skids in etch bays, recovery at rocket pads. Make it simple. A standardized rebate per liter of verified capture in year 1, stepping down as systems mature. Verification is metered, not self-reported. Suppliers can co-sign the numbers as part of service contracts, with their own incentives to reduce wasted deliveries. Upstream to risk recovery. Gas processors don't build helium units when helium looks like a side hustle. Offer accelerated depreciation or investment tax credits for helium skids on qualifying fields, but gate them with performance. Prove recovery rates and uptime for a year or the benefit clause back. Pair credits with long-dated offtake anchored by auction strips so CFOs can model cash flows without fairy dust. And insist on smart venting rules. Fields above a helium threshold must file a recovery feasibility plan before flaring away a non-renewable. Don't centralize the whole fix. Build micro buffers near demand. a small cryogenic sphere on a hospital cluster's campus, fed by reclaimed gas and topped by deliveries, buys a week of slack without parking warm ISOs. A regional academic consortium can share a liquefier and a cylinder farm with priority protocols baked in. A launch site can keep an emergency high-purity bank under shade, tested monthly, with automated switchover that never makes the news. Micro story, a Midwest hospital pair installed a shared mini-sphere and a reclaim line between neighboring buildings. 6 months later, a Panhandle trip hit. Their dashboard went yellow, not red. Their radiology directors never met before the project. Now they trade staff tips and spare couplers. Write reliability into the contract culture. Award points for suppliers who prove short dock to bay dwell, night fill capacity, insulated ISO fleets and alternative port plans. Pay small premiums for documented incident response times and predictive maintenance programs at refineries tied to your route. Penalize avoidable boil-off, not just missed ETAs. If a vendor cuts your losses by 5% before the molecule leaves their yard, that's value. Lock coordination with LNG. Helium units tied to trains should publish maintenance calendars in a standard format 6 months out and confirm 1 month out. Build automatic reminders into procurement tools. Treat a slip turnaround like a flight delay. Immediate notice, revised ETA, and a map of knock-on effects. Reward operators who hit calendars with premium volumes in the next auction. Make opacity expensive. Guard against 1996's ghost. Never use fixed non-market prices to drain a buffer or move public volumes. If the state participates, it pays and sells at the auction price, period. If it wants to shield critical users, it does it with targeted vouchers redeemed at market, not with cheap molecules that teach waste. Culture seals the system. Post the dials. Celebrate leaders saved with the same pride you put on an image quality metric or a yield chart. Train technicians until a frosty bayonet and a silent leak are as urgent as any code blue. Put helium risk on risk registers. Hold short drills. What happens if the Tuesday truck doesn't arrive? Until the answer is a shrug. We don't need a bigger promise. We need cleaner signals, small buffers that act like brakes, not blindfolds, upstream projects that pencil because the price is honest, and end users who treat helium like blood. Do that, and the next freeze, leak, or diplomatic squall becomes a wobble, not a headline. The quiet geopolitics, leverage, sanctions, and soft power. Helium doesn't fly flags, but the people who move it do. The leverage sits in quiet offices where contracts get inked and in ministries that publish schedules, or don't. When a minister delays a turnaround notice by a week, a hospital scheduler in Milan feels it a month later. That's soft power you can't see on a map. Start with the simple math of dependence. The Panhandle serves North America like a circulatory system. Qatar backs Asia and steadies Europe. Russia promised a third anchor and delivered a question mark. Whoever steadies your region also sets the tone of your negotiations. If your country's MRI fleet and semiconductor footprint lean on one corridor, price is only half your risk. The other half is relationship. Sanctions cut diagonally through that reality. After 2022, Russian helium turned from soon to maybe, and maybe is poison for procurement. Licenses, insurance, spare parts, each step became a checkpoint. Even when a shipment could move, buyers had to ask, will paying for this tie us up with regulators? Will a software patch for a compressor violate a list we didn't write? Many decided the same thing. Treat Russian tons as upside, and don't stake medicine or spaceflight on paperwork that can vanish with a headline. Qatar learned a different lesson in 2017. The Gulf Rift closed land routes and complicated airspace. Helium plants didn't break, logistics did. That episode taught Doha what leverage looks like when it's applied against you. A silent scoreboard of port dwell times and rerouted ships. Qatar answered with redundancy, alternate ports, bigger ISO fleets, diversified shipping partners. The message to buyers was subtle but clear. We're resilient, and resilience is a kind of power you can trust. America's leverage is older and messier. The Panhandle's reliability creates expectations, and expectations create political pressure. When U.S. hospitals face allocations, phone calls move uphill fast. That produces policy moves, auction timelines, reserve rules, export noise, felt by suppliers abroad. The quiet threat isn't a ban, it's a priority list that tilts toward domestic critical users in a crunch. Allies know it. They hedge accordingly, balancing U.S. contracts with Qatari volumes so a congressional hearing doesn't echo into their radiology suites. Micro story. A European ministry asked a supplier for assurance of medical priority during a U.S. outage. The supplier replied with a clause that only triggers if three conditions align: pipeline pressure, auction fail, LNG notice. The ministry signed anyway. Assurances written in contingency language are still currency in a tight market. Soft power also hides in standards. The countries that set helium purity specs for medical use and the testing regimes for cylinders and ISO containers control who can ship where. A subtle change, tightening moisture limits or requiring traceable batch analytics, can slow a newcomer's entry and privilege incumbents with labs and auditors in place. It's safety on paper, it's also a gate. Buyers who want to diversify supply sometimes discover the bottleneck is a certification stamp, not a plant capacity. Data is diplomacy. Operators who publish realistic turnaround calendars and uptime stats earn trust and better contracts. Those who hide behind press releases find their molecules discounted in planning models. A buyer can't move an LNG train, but they can move risk premiums. After the 2017 rift, Qatar's calendar discipline was a diplomatic act. After 2022, opaque signals from Amur turned into an unspoken tariff. Treat promised volumes as probable -1. Then there's the public theater. Balloon bans, headline bills, speeches about critical minerals that include gases by mistake. Symbolic moves make voters feel heard, but the real leverage lives in procurement rooms where health systems bundle contracts across borders, in research consortia that coordinate recovery investments, and in tech alliances that tie fab expansions to secure gas corridors. A state that helps fund reclaim in its own hospitals and universities spends political capital where it counts. A state that subsidizes balloons earns a hashtag. Microstory, a small country with one national hospital negotiated a joint tender with a neighboring state. They offered a multi-year, night-fill, zero-loss commitment across both systems with synchronized delivery windows and shared micro-storage. Two suppliers fought to win. Prices stabilized, service improved. No speeches required. Sanctions can be blunt, leverage doesn't have to be. Quiet incentives, insurance guarantees for ISO shipments through specified ports, tax credits for upstream recovery tied to export to allies, joint stockpiles among research networks, shift behavior without headlines. So does transparency enforced by contracts. Publish your dials, earn our business, fail, lose volumes next quarter. The softest power is competence. Countries that shrink demand with reclaim and sealed magnets turn geopolitical shocks into scheduling annoyances. They can afford to say no. The ones still venting their future to the sky can't. In a market where atoms drift to space forever, sovereignty starts at the fill port and ends in the logistics plan. The flags come after. The next decade, demand growth and fragility. More MRIs, more fabs, more quantum fridges, more launches. Demand climbs while supply stays lumpy. North Field expansions slip months. Panhandle reliability hinges on aging steel. Amur remains a maybe. Growth concentrates risk into calendars. Winners cut losses, reclaim hard, and plan to survive two simultaneous hiccups, not one. Resolution and meaning. Helium won't forgive habits. Only technique will. But technique lives inside geopolitics, and that's the part most people miss. 3 corridors, America's Panhandle, Qatar's North Field, Russia's Amur/Yamal, shape hospital schedules, launch windows, and fab yields. Their incentives and calendars decide whether a pediatric scan or a countdown happens on time. If you want stability, you have to align physics with policy and put small buffers where they actually intercept risk. Geopolitical implications you can't ignore. Dependence is leverage. The region that steadies your supply sets terms. North America leans on the Panhandle pulse. Asia rides Qatar's LNG clock. Russia's Amur remains promise with political baggage. Treat claims from unproven sources as upside, not baseline. Logistics is foreign policy in slow motion. A port delay, a rerouted ship, a sanctions list, or a quiet export license can move your appointment date a month. Data transparency, calendars, pressures, storage levels, reduces rumor hoarding that turns squeezes into crises. Standards are soft power. Whoever writes purity specs, cylinder rules, and audit regimes chooses who ships where. That gatekeeping can stabilize quality or quietly privilege incumbents and choke diversification. What to do? Practical solutions that survive politics. Demand side first. Measure losses at the fill port. Mandate zero-loss bayonets, night fills, pre-cool protocols, install recovery and reclaim where physics allows. Hospitals, labs, fabs, and pads should post dashboards, boil off, reclaim yield, ETA, so behavior moves with numbers, not emails. Micro buffers near demand, shared mini-spheres for hospital clusters, campus liquefiers for universities, in-bay reclaim for fabs, shaded emergency banks at pads. Small, local Slack beats warm ISOs bleeding in the sun. Clean signals and a smart public buffer. Frequent, transparent auctions with forward strips. A modest, rules-based reserve that releases on defined outages and refills at market. No fixed-price drains that train waste. Tie contracts to reliability. Award points for night fill capacity. Insulated ISO fleets. Dock-to-bay dwell under 90 minutes, alternate port plans, and published LNG turnaround calendars. Pay for avoided boil-off and verified purity, not just delivered liters. Upstream recovery that pencils. Accelerated depreciation or credits for helium skids on qualifying gas fields, gated by proven uptime and recovery. Pair with long-dated offtake anchored to auction prices so CFOs green light steel. Regional cooperation. Joint tenders for medical systems, shared academic liquefiers, coordinated maintenance windows aligned to LNG calendars. Publish the dials so hoarding becomes unnecessary and obvious. If you work in medicine, semiconductors, research, or launch, your margin is built in checklists and contracts more than headlines. The countries that conserve at the port, reclaim in the bay, and buy transparency from their suppliers will turn diplomatic squalls into scheduling annoyances. The ones that don't will keep hearing metal hiss at 2 a.m. Subscribe for true infrastructures that quietly decide launches, surgeries, and science. Then watch the next chapter on fragile elements reshaping power. If this mattered to your work, share it with the person who controls the checklist and the one who signs the contract.